Deep within the Ozark Mountains, in a remote part of Missouri, lies a story known to few and told by even fewer. Generations of families lived in isolation, creating their own distinct world with its own rules, nestled among dense forests that blocked the sun and deep valleys. The case of the Whitaker sisters was first documented in 1978 by a rural doctor, Dr. Robert Liston. Sisters Eleanor, Margaret, and Ruth, born between 1932 and 1937, were the daughters of first-degree cousins. This was a direct result of a family line spanning centuries of marriage between relatives. I noted something peculiar when I first visited that property, wrote Dr. Liston in his medical diary, which is now preserved at the University of Missouri. The curtains remained closed, even during the day. He was greeted by the older brother, Thomas, the only sibling who appeared to be without visible deformities. What the doctor discovered inside that isolated home would trouble him throughout his entire career. The three sisters suffered from severe facial deformities, including misaligned jaws, asymmetrical eyes, cranial malformations, and extreme dental problems. What was even more striking was that they all wore handmade cloth masks, even inside their home and in the presence of their own family. Liston recounted that Eleanor, the oldest, was the first to remove her mask so he could examine her. The reflection of pain in her eyes when she realized my initial reaction stays with me to this day. Medical analyses later revealed that the Whitaker sisters had mandibulofacial dysostosis, a rare genetic condition typically associated with Treacher-Collins syndrome. Their manifestations were particularly severe due to successive consanguineous marriages. Parish records and local censuses later surveyed confirmed that the family had at least 7 generations of cousin marriages. The outside world remained unaware of the sisters' existence until 1983, when a brief mention in a regional medical journal caught the attention of the scientific community. However, the family consistently protected the sisters from public exposure, refusing any social scrutiny. Genetic isolation and societal stigma. The Whitaker sisters' story is not an isolated one. Instead, it highlights a broader phenomenon in isolated rural American communities. Here, geographic, cultural, and religious isolation created conditions where consanguineous marriage practices persisted long after they were widely abandoned elsewhere. Cases like the Whitaker sisters, documented with this level of detail, are rare, and our research illuminates stories that society often chooses to forget. To fully grasp the drama of these women who concealed their faces behind masks, we need to understand the science behind their conditions. Dr. James Warren, a geneticist at the University of Columbia who studied similar cases in 1992, explained, consanguinity itself doesn't create new genetic mutations. What it does is increase the chance that harmful recessive genes, which would usually remain dormant for generations, manifest when the same genetic variant is inherited from both parents. In the Whitaker sisters' specific case, later genetic analyses revealed an extraordinary concentration of deleterious recessive alleles, a perfect genetic storm that resulted in their severe deformities. Medical records from Shannon County, Missouri, preserved in the State Historic Archive, show that the incidence of congenital defects in this region between 1920 and 1970 was 47% higher than the national average. A public health report from 1965, which remained classified for decades due to concerns about stigmatization, documented clusters of congenital malformations in specific families. The triple isolation and the masks. The communities in the Ozark Mountains developed a triple isolation, explained anthropologist Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, who studied the region for 2 decades. The isolation was geographic, with rugged terrain and precarious roads. Cultural, marked by a deep distrust of outsiders. Genetic, involving a limited pool of potential partners. This isolation was not accidental. Historical records indicate that many of these families deliberately fled scrutiny from wider society. The Whitaker family, for instance, descended from settlers who arrived in the region in the 1830s, purposely choosing remote land to avoid religious persecution. The community developed marriage practices that favored unions within the same family circle, often justified by particular religious interpretations and the need to keep the land within the family. Local church documents dated 1875 show a local pastor defending marriages between cousins as blessed by the Lord to maintain the lineage. When Eleanor Whitaker was 20 years old in 1952, an itinerant doctor offered surgical treatment to alleviate their deformities, but the family refused. According to Dr. Listant's report, they viewed the girl's condition not as a disease but as a divine trial that they should endure with dignity. The masks emerged as a practical solution. Initially made by the girl's mother and later by themselves, the masks were carefully sewn from dark fabrics, covering most of the face with openings only for the eyes. Rare photographs preserved in Dr. Listant's medical archive show that the masks were surprisingly elaborate, with embroidered details that suggested an idealized face. The paradoxical tragedy is that the same isolation that contributed to their conditions also protected them from the cruel social scrutiny they would undoubtedly have faced in the outside world. Life behind the fabric. In the few interviews gathered in Dr. Listant's confidential medical archive between 1978 and 1985, partially released for research in 2010, the Whitaker sisters revealed fragments of their extraordinary lives. Margaret, the middle sister, described their daily routine. "We woke up before dawn to do the outside chores. It's better to work when it's dark." The three sisters created a meticulous system to minimize their exhibition. They raised chickens and goats, animals that, according to them, didn't care about appearances, and cultivated a garden at the back of the property, surrounded by tall trees. Their brother, Thomas, handled all interactions with the outside world, including shopping in the city, negotiations, and bank affairs. "Eleanor was the best seamstress I've ever met," said an elderly neighbor in 1992, who occasionally exchanged eggs for embroidery with the family. "I never saw her face, but her hands created true works of art." The Whitaker house, documented in rare county file photos, was a two-story structure with small windows and permanently closed curtains. The interior, according to descriptions, was surprisingly clean and organized, with mirrors notably absent. The walls displayed photographs of distant ancestors from generations before the severe deformities. Ruth, the youngest sister, kept a detailed diary, partially preserved in the archives of the Historical Society of Missouri. In a 1965 entry, she wrote, "Today I observed my reflection in the well water for a moment with the light of the dusk. It almost seemed normal. I dreamed what it would be like to walk around the city without shouting or being driven away." The masks became more than simple coverings, they were alternative identities. Each sister possessed several masks for different occasions. Eleanor, the most skilled with needle and thread, created masks with subtly different expressions, one with a slight smile for special days, another more neutral for daily life. "The most extraordinary thing," wrote Dr. Liston, "is that they rarely removed the masks, even when they were alone at home." Margaret explained to him that they had grown so accustomed to wearing them that they felt naked without them. Few visitors who entered the house, especially Dr. Liston and occasionally the local pastor, reported that the sisters appeared to have developed an elaborate body language to compensate for their limited facial expression. Head inclinations, hand gestures, and variations in posture communicated emotions that their covered faces could not express. Medical records show that, in addition to facial deformities, the sisters suffered from secondary health problems, all consistent with syndromes associated with prolonged consanguinity. Eleanor had severe scoliosis, Margaret presented progressive hearing loss, and Ruth suffered from chronic breathing problems. If this story resonates with you, comment now. Behind every mask, a soul yearns for dignity. The lives of these women are a reminder that acceptance and compassion are gifts many have never known. Global patterns of genetic isolation. The story of the Whitaker sisters, while extraordinary, is not unique. Research conducted by the Institute of Human Genetics at Johns Hopkins University between 1985 and 1997 identified at least 27 family clusters in the Americas with similar patterns of genetic isolation and high rates of consanguineous marriages, leading to severe genetic conditions. In 1976, medical anthropologist Dr. Eduardo documented the case of veiled women in an isolated community in the Chihuahua Mountains, Mexico. 5 women from the same extensive family had facial deformities similar to those of the Whitaker sisters and adopted similar concealment practices. Dr. Eduardo noted that the masks have become part of their cultural identity, transforming a necessity into a tradition. In the Appalachian region, which spans several eastern American states, a study on the health of isolated communities conducted between 1970 and 1982 identified multiple cases of congenital malformations in communities with high rates of endogamy, marrying within the group. The study, which was controversial at the time for its ethical and social implications, remained partially confidential until 2005. The Melungeon community, an isolated tri-racial population in the Appalachians, presented documented cases in Hancock County, Tennessee. Rural Dr. William Kennedy registered in 1963, I found 4 adult women using permanent veils, all from the same family lineage. Local residents respect their privacy, but outsiders often react with cruelty. In Nova Scotia, Canada, the small community of Fishers Harbour harbored the case of the MacDonald sisters, descendants of Scottish settlers who arrived in 1820 and remained extremely isolated. The 3 sisters, born in the 1940s, had severe facial deformities due to multiple generations of cousin marriages. Parish records confirm 7 marriages among first cousins in just 3 generations. The isolation of these communities was not only geographical but also informational. A review of medical records from the Appalachian region by Dr. Harold Mitchell in 1988 revealed that basic information on the genetic risks associated with consanguineous marriages rarely reached these isolated communities. When it did arrive, it was often disregarded as external interference in established traditions. In a 1990 interview with the medical journal Frontiers in Genetics, an unidentified woman, referred to as an MS, from an isolated community in Kentucky, who also used a mask to hide severe facial deformities, said, "No one told us that marrying cousins could cause problems. It was what everyone did. My parents were cousins. My grandparents were cousins. When my face started to develop differently, everyone thought it was just bad luck." A consistent pattern emerged from these various cases. Geographical isolation created the conditions for genetic isolation, often reinforced by cultural or religious beliefs that favored marriage within the same family or community. The subsequent social stigmatization deepened this isolation, creating a cycle that persisted for generations. Dr. Paul Bugman, a geneticist who studied multiple cases, observed in 1990, the most disturbing aspect is not the genetic conditions themselves, but how the response to these conditions often worsened the suffering of affected families. Public health records reveal that in many of these cases, basic medical interventions that could have alleviated some complications were either refused or never offered. Isolation, initially a cause of the conditions, also became an obstacle to treatment. Investigative journalist Michael Harkins, who attempted to document some of these cases in 1988, wrote, "I found closed doors, unanswered calls, and occasionally veiled threats. These communities have learned through painful experiences that exposure rarely brings benefits and often results in humiliation." Anthropologist Dr. Caroline Fisher, who studied isolated communities for 3 decades, noted, the use of masks, veils, or other methods of concealment became more than a practical response to physical deformities. In many cases, it evolved into a distinct cultural expression, almost an act of resistance against a world that rejected them. Legacy and hope. Time did not stop in the Ozark Mountains. In 1987, Eleanor Whitaker passed away at the age of 55 due to respiratory complications, a secondary condition related to her craniofacial malformations. Margaret followed in 1995 at the age of 61. Ruth, the youngest, lived until 2002, dying at 65. The family home, abandoned after the deaths of Ruth and her brother Thomas in 1998, remained for years as a silent monument to lives lived in the shadows. In 2008, a fire destroyed the structure, taking with it the last physical traces of this extraordinary family. However, the legacy of the Whitaker sisters and similar women in the Americas persists in unexpected forms. In 1992, the Craniofacial Anomalies Foundation was established, partly inspired by the cases documented by Dr. Liston. The foundation offers surgical treatment and psychological support for children and adults with severe facial malformations. Dr. Rachel Cohen, a plastic surgeon specializing in facial reconstruction, commented in 2010, "Cases like the Whitaker sisters show us the human cost of failures in our social and healthcare systems." Today, many of these conditions can be treated with relatively simple surgical interventions if identified early. Advances in genetic counseling and prenatal diagnostic techniques mean that many of the conditions that afflicted them could be prevented or treated. However, the social stigma associated with facial deformities persists, albeit in more subtle ways. The discovery in 1999 of some of the Whitaker sisters' original masks, preserved by a neighbor after Ruth's death, offered surprising insights. The masks, now part of the University of Missouri's permanent collection, reveal an extraordinary handicraft made with multiple layers of carefully sewn fabric. Each mask has subtly defined facial characteristics, contours of cheeks, a suggestion of lips, even embroidered eyebrows. These are not simple utilitarian coverings, noted museum curator Dr. Elizabeth Chen. These are attempts to recreate the facial normality that genetics denied them. There is a moving dignity in this effort. In a rare interview given to Dr. Liston in 1980, Ruth Whitaker explained the meaning of the masks for her and her sisters. People think we use them to hide, and that's partially true. But we also use them to reveal ourselves the way we choose. When I make a mask, I decide who I will be that day. It is a power that my real face never gave me. Ruth's diary, which spans almost 4 decades of her life, offers moving glimpses of a deeply sensitive and reflective woman. In a 1972 entry, she wrote, "Some people think we live tragic lives, stuck in this house with these faces, but we know joy, too. When Eleanor plays the piano at dusk. When Margaret tells stories that make us laugh until we cry. When Thomas returns from the city with a new book to read together. At these times, I completely forget the masks." In isolated rural communities, consanguineous marriage practices have decreased dramatically in recent decades due to greater mobility, access to education, and awareness of genetic risks. However, genetic isolation persists as a public health challenge in some remote regions of the Americas. The study on marriage patterns in isolated communities, published in 2018 by the National Institute of Health, documented an 87% reduction in first-degree cousin marriages in U.S. rural areas since 1950. However, the same study identified pockets where endogamic practices persist, especially in communities with strong cultural or religious isolation. The stories of the women who live behind masks remind us of the lasting power of social stigma and the extraordinary human resistance in the face of adversity. As Ruth Whitaker wrote in her diary in a 1997 entry, "Behind this mask, I have lived a complete life, limited in some respects, yes, but rich in others. I have known love, beauty, and purpose." What else can anyone ask? If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here so I can get to know you and who truly follows the channel." Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this that reveal forgotten aspects of our shared humanity. Leave a like to support this work of historical documentation and share it with someone who values understanding human experiences in all their complexity.